Hello, you are viewing our makeup lecture for Wednesday, February 20th. In this lecture, we're going to cover U.S. waves of immigration. And when examining the waves of immigration, we're going to look at a few different factors. When did these waves occur? Why did they occur? Where were people coming from? And also, what was the reaction to these different waves? Just a reminder of what we have coming up. On Monday, your field report is due by 2 p.m. Remember, we're not going to meet in class on Monday, so make sure that you're using that time to finalize your report and get it submitted by the deadline. Our exam is scheduled for next Wednesday, the 27th. Later this afternoon, on Wednesday afternoon, a study guide will be available. And then I want you to make sure that you have the religion assignment on your agenda for next week. So while we wrap up Unit 1 on Wednesday with the exam, Unit 2 is going to kick off the following week. So the religion assignment is currently available on Blackboard, and I want to make sure that you put that into your time management for this week or next. The slide here shows us the foreign-born population in the United States from the Civil War through the census in 2010. You'll notice a couple trends here. The amount of foreign-born people is increasing. So as our population grows, with it, the foreign-born population, or that segment of the population, is also growing. And you'll also notice how the red line really rises rapidly since about 1970. We're going to look at why that happened in a little bit with one of our waves of immigration. You'll also see that in 2010, a little over 12% of the U.S. population was foreign-born. While that is a relatively high number, it's not as high as some of the figures that we found in the late 18 and early 1900s. When we discuss immigration, again, we're going to look at the waves. Where were people coming from? Where are they going? Why? When? Those questions. And also want to keep in mind the impact on the cultural landscape of these different groups. So in the images here, you see a Chinatown in the top right, and then you see a couple images from the Alan Marcus article on transnational landscapes on the bottom right. And these different landscapes reflect a few key themes, right? We're looking at migration streams, which we've talked about already. We're looking at syncretism. We're looking at how these groups blend with existing groups in the cultural landscape. And something we're going to pick up later on this semester that I want to introduce at this point is the idea of segregation. So while these transnational landscapes evolve and while these migration streams continue to form and new streams are created, we often find that groups, whether voluntary or involuntary, end up living in enclaves. When we look at our immigrants over time, our immigrants reflect a few different similar characteristics. One, they tend to be younger. One of the things we look at with mobility is that age range of 18 to 30 tends to be a time when people have fewer obligations. They have fewer commitments holding them to a certain place, so they are more mobile. We've discussed the idea that education also makes you more mobile, so being aware of other places, other people, increasing your opportunities. The economic pull factor is generally what we find driving immigration today. And one of the things we find with our immigrants in the United States is what's called a bipolar distribution. So when we lay out different socio-cultural or socioeconomic characteristics, we see that a number of our immigrants are at the top, highest earners, most educated. And we also see that a large chunk of our immigrants are at the bottom, lower education, lower earnings. So while we add foreign-born residents into the mix, we see that they tend to be either at the top or bottom end of our socio-demographic variables. When we discuss immigration, it's important that we always recognize reactions to immigration. And the photo on the graphic on this slide shows us really a mock reaction that the Pilgrims might have had experienced when they arrived in the 1620s to the New World. So it's a bit ironic when we think about a nativist approach today when walls are going up, both physical walls, both economic walls, both cultural walls, to those that may have been in place in the past when other groups arrived. Reactions to immigration often rely on politics. When we look at immigration regimes, what is a local, state, or national reaction to immigration trends? Oftentimes policies, like some of the policies that are currently being discussed today. We recently had a president, or our president noted that we are experiencing a national emergency because of immigration. So generally what we see with political regimes is a kind of a sliding scale. We see xenophobia, the fear of outsiders, the fear of changing what might be, quote, an American or a nativist culture. And we also see regimes, or we see political groups that embrace change, embrace immigration. A couple of the quotes here on the slide refer to different groups that arrived at different times. You'll see the first quote is from President Herbert Hoover, and as Italian immigrants arrived in the United States in the first quarter of the 20th century, there was a reaction. There was some that embraced, some that engaged, some that incorporated Italians into the workforce, into local cultures, but there were others that saw a foreign group as different. A foreign group is a threat. The second quote here is from Donald Trump when he was running for president, and part of his platform was to stoke xenophobia when it comes to immigration. And you can see here his ideas on individuals that are crossing from Mexico into the United States. This slide shows presidents from the same party as the other slide, so this isn't in any way to show the Republican Party as anti-immigration. What it's trying to show here is that over time, individuals, parties evolve, they take different stances on immigration. So Woodrow Wilson takes more of a long-term perspective on immigration, and that our ancestors, whether they arrived here willingly or forced, are part of America's history of immigration. And George W. Bush, who was president in the early 21st century, also embraced immigration to a degree. Take a moment to adjust your eyes to this graphic, and I'll send a link that contains this graphic. But what we're looking at here are different periods of immigration and migration in the United States. You'll see that the colonial period, pre-1820, and we'll get into who was arriving at that time. And then we go Old Wave and New Wave. And then we have the Great Migration. And right below the Great Migration, you'll see a bit of a tightening of groups coming into the United States. And then after the Great Migration, we have our ethnic kaleidoscope. And you see a great expansion in people coming into the United States, but you'll notice that the colors are different. So the colors on the left end of this spectrum reflect Northern and Western Europe, and then we get into Southern and Eastern Europe. And then on the right end of the spectrum, we see individuals coming from Latin America, coming from Asia, coming from Africa. And those individuals are outnumbering our former European immigrant streams. So on the right end of this graphic, we see where we are today. We see the evolution of our current wave of immigration. The first period is known as the colonial period, and the graphic on this slide shows you Baltimore City in 1815. Baltimore City would have been one of many cities on the east coast of the United States that welcomed immigrants into the country. And when we see who is arriving at this time, we had a primarily Protestant group coming in willingly. We had British, French, Swedish, and Dutch people coming to North America because of the establishment of former colonies and outposts. So British North America, the former 13 colonies, provided a very welcoming, receiving community for individuals coming from the UK. The French presence, the Swedish presence, and the Dutch presence was also mixed into the east coast of North America. So during this time, we had our small European group coming willingly, and we also had a sizable population coming through forced migration. So during this time, we also had the triangle trade, where slaves came from West Africa and arrived on the east coast of the United States. So our early population, after the American Indian population was relatively eliminated, our early population consisted primarily of Europeans from these countries, and also Africans who were forced through the slave trade to arrive on the East Coast. Our second wave of immigration is considered the Old Wave, and I've tried to highlight some of the countries here that make up the old wave. So you'll see we're still primarily looking at North and Western Europe. We're looking at the growing industry in the United States, the start of the Industrial Revolution. We're looking at construction, we're looking at mining, we're looking at railroads. We're looking at a number of labor-intensive industries that opened up. These industries provided opportunity for people to arrive in the United States. During this wave, we see primarily a rural to urban immigration. This idea that America is the land of opportunity really began to evolve at this time. We also saw that different groups were starting to arrive, like Catholics from Ireland and Germany were coming on the scene. And we think of Catholic as very much a mainstream religion today, part of our culture, very integrated in. But during this old wave, those Catholic immigrants were also seen as loyal to the Pope, were also feared, were really just different than the current Protestant group here in the United States. So while this group seems very mainstream today, these countries like Ireland and Germany really reflected a different group of people coming into the United States. And as you can see here, sentiment around this group, primarily the poor, lesser educated Irish, this interaction, this engagement was relatively hostile. Groups like the Know Nothing Party formed during this time. You see here it's a bit ironic that the Know Nothings refer to themselves as Native Americans. And this group, which started out as a relatively private secret society, was a very much an anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant society that influenced local and national politics. So think today how local, state, and national politics react to immigration, react to groups that are different arriving in the United States. And that's what Catholics would have seen in the mid-1800s. This image here shows a look at how German and Irish immigrants were engaged when it comes to elections. So something that we heard in the 2016 election was that there was election fraud. So back in the 1800s, as Irish and German arrived, one, there was a race to get these votes, and two, there was the suspicion of fraud. That Germans and Irish, as you can see here, that were whiskey and beer drinkers, not the best members of society as portrayed in this image, would have rigged an election or would have created a very hostile environment for an open election process. This slide shows us an immigration terminal in Baltimore Harbor. The area circled on the bottom is called Lazaretto Point. Lazaretto is a term for a sick ward. It's an Italian term for a sick ward. So as immigrants were arriving up the Chesapeake Bay and into Baltimore, the only rules at this point were to not be sick. So if an individual was sick, they would have been dropped off at the bottom at Lazaretto Point. If individuals passed a really general wellness check, they would have been brought into Baltimore's Inner Harbor and they would have got off the boat at Fells Point. So Fells Point, beginning in the early 1800s, really became an immigrant community, and that has persisted for over 200 years. So when we think about immigration requirements today versus those in the past, they were much easier in the past as far as requirements. If you were healthy, you were getting in. Today, our immigration rules are much more complicated, something that we'll look at here in a little bit with our upcoming waves of immigration. So this is going to end this part of the lecture. I'll send a link for the second part of the lecture, which will pick up on the new wave of immigration.